You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Stewart O'Nan.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. We've got a great show lined up for you today. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. No matter how you listen, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Pandora, Spotify, or YouTube, you can subscribe to the show and never miss an episode. I'd like to thank some sponsors today. Scribophile is a respectful online writing workshop and writers community. Writers of all skill levels join to improve each other's work with thoughtful critiques and by sharing their writing experiences. We're the writing group to join if you want to find beta readers, get the best feedback around, learn how to get published, and be a part of the friendliest and most successful writing workshop online. Improve your writing by receiving detailed critiques. Learn from a vast collection of free writing resources. Make lifelong friends in our busy community of writers. Writing is a solitary art, but that doesn't mean you have to be lonely. Lucky for you, there are thousands of writers on Scribophile every day, and we're a really friendly bunch. You've never seen a writing group like this one? Join Scribophile today at scribophile.community. Business Essentials for Writers: How to Make Money in an Ever-Changing Industry by James Nettles. Business Essentials for Authors is your Business 101 guide for the publishing industry. Whether you've never published at all or are looking to take your professional career up a notch in an easy-to-read and conversational way, the book covers the 5 pillars of business. We look at all of this and more from a long-term strategic view, how to get the plan done, and the mindset to make it all work. Business Essentials for Writers: How to Make Money in an Ever-Changing Industry by James Nettles. Both Sides of the Law: The Casper Halliday NYPD Series, Book 1 by Nathan Roden. He shared his father's dream of becoming a detective. A prison sentence was not part of his plan. Casper Halliday's dream began to unravel 2 months before his 16th birthday. His father, Bobby, resigned from the NYPD after 15 years without an explanation. Casper's parents fought. Sirens closed in on their home from every direction. The sound that had always been a source of comfort now brought only humiliation. Bobby Halliday moved out. Casper's dream dissolved into a daily fight for survival. All he wanted now was to finish high school so he could ease his mother's burden. On his 17th birthday, in the throes of depression, Casper made a bad decision. That decision brought him face to face with one of the most dangerous men in the city. In Casper's world, there is laughter and there are tears. There's light and there's bitter darkness. There are improbable friends and unspeakable enemies. The Casper Halliday NYPD series launches with the most unlikely of beginnings. Read Both Sides of the Law today. The ebook edition includes a sneak peek of Ghost Man, Book 2 in the series. For the Words is a unique writing motivator unlike anything I've seen. For the Words is an online writing platform which motivates writers of all backgrounds to increase their word count through gamification. Writing can be challenging, especially when you need to consistently produce a high output of words. By injecting a little fun into the routine and using daily rewards to promote a healthy writing habit, For the Words makes it easier to reach that word count. We're a community of bloggers, professional authors, college and high school students, research scientists, gamers, and first-time writers from all over the world. Come for the words, stay for the fun. Go to 4, that's the number 4, thewords.com. Writers, the internet is one of the best tools for research and creativity. It can also be one of the biggest hindrances to productivity, distracting you from doing the seat in the chair, hand on keyboard work. Rescue Time gives you an accurate picture of how you spend your time to help you become more productive every single day. Spot inefficiencies in your day and become better at managing your time. Create a goal like spending less than 1 hour per day on email to help you stay focused. Set an alarm to tell you when you spent more than 2 hours on Facebook. Try Rescue Time and use our special discount code for 30% off a Rescue Time premium account by going to rescuetime.com/author stories. Let us help you rescue your time. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Stewart O'Nan on the show with me today. He has a fantastic new book called Henry Himself. And you guys, if you're looking for a Father's Day present coming up later this weekend, this is an excellent book for that. And aside from that, I think this book has reach for everyone, and we're going to talk all about it today. Welcome to the show, Stewart.
Thank you, Hank.
Stewart, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I guess when I was in grade school, I think 6th or 7th grade, I wanted to write a pirate novel.
As one does.
Yeah, as one does, yes. I was excited about Kidnapped and Treasure Island, big Robert Louis Stevenson fan, and I just sat down and started to write a pirate novel. I had no idea exactly where it was going, but I knew it would be, maybe an island, there'd be treasure, adventure on the way. Yeah.
Love it. Were you a big reader as a kid?
A huge reader. My mother took me to the bookmobile when I think I was 4 years old. And I remember climbing the steps up into the bookmobile, picking books and then going back home with them. And, going to the library all the time, a big comic book reader. And maybe my first favorite author was Charles M. Schulz, who did Peanuts. I loved that world there and those characters. And I still think they're pretty amazing and complex characters. They
are. And to have such a long run and, new things to put these characters into, is a testament to the kind of storyteller that he was.
Yeah, and sort of the depth and the vulnerability of the characters. Amazing. I once met him, which is a great highlight, great thrill. And I did not know, but he was a combat soldier in the Second World War and saw combat on the islands in the Pacific, some of the worst combat of the war. And I'm sure that colored, the way he saw the world.
I'm sure it did. And now that you mentioned your love of Charles Schulz, I find a lot of similarity in the work that you do, especially in Henry Himself, the new book. There are some there are some really deep things going on within the mundane, and your wry humor that you bring into it is very reminiscent of the way Schulz could take something that you could tell that he was dealing with some personal darkness there, but do it with a wink and a smile and the ways that we could all connect with.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, I also think that was the way a lot of the people who came back from that war dealt with it, because that idea of PTSD and all that was not really sort of hashed out so well after Vietnam. So I think and still, I think to this day, just a lot of people who've been through war, any war, they just live with it.
Right. At what point did you start kind of working on your own stories? I know you were a lover of stories and comic books and Schulz and all of that. At what point did you start making up characters of your own?
Not till I was in my mid-20s. I kind of put any idea of writing aside when I went to get trained to be an aerospace engineer, and then I was working in the industry at Grumman Aerospace out on Long Island. And somewhere in there, I just decided I'd try to make that leap again, and from reader to writer. And I'd go home and I'd write stories in my basement. So I was probably 23, 24 years old at that point.
Wow. What kinds of stories were you telling then?
Mostly about people that I'd met. I wasn't inventing as much as observing. And so I'd meet people in passing, people that I'd see every day, like, the guy that sold me my cigarettes, at the convenience mart. And I'd try to wonder, what was his life like? I'd try to follow him home sort of in my imagination and try to figure out, what was going on with him. And then I'd try to write about it.
Wow. There's I think we all do that in the beginning, start kind of reporting on the world that we see, and then allowing our imagination to kind of run wild. Do you see a progression from those early stories to where you are? What do you think that you took away from that time beginning writing stories?
I just that curiosity, I guess. The understanding that I just didn't know much, and that there was a whole world out there that I could, try to find out about, and that things would always sort of remain a mystery to me. Also, I was imitating at that time too. I was imitating some of my favorite writers, and my favorite writers at the time were this weird mix of, say, Harlan Ellison and James Joyce.
That's a great combination.
So there was this. Yeah, well, it was, and I think there were a bunch of writers at that time that were kind of doing the same thing. Jonathan Lethem, Rick Moody, and we were seeing a little bit more plot coming into story, a little more genre plot coming into, what we thought of as literary fiction, which was good. I mean, at the time, it sort of needed that little shot in the arm, and I think that stayed that way for about 20 years, I think. And now it's kind of fading away.
Yeah. How did you start breaking in to having your stories noticed?
I would just send them away to literary magazines. I'd ship them off. I did the simultaneous submissions. So I'd take, a stack of, 30, manila envelopes to the post office and wait in line there at lunchtime when I was working at Grumman, and ship them off and, hope that one might get accepted. And, for everyone that you got accepted, there was, 20, 25 rejections. So it was good training for a writer. Yeah.
Do you feel like that learning to deal with rejection, does that build up, character? Does that prepare you for the rough days ahead? Like when you're a new writer and you're getting that kind of rejection, what fuels you to keep going on?
Well, what fuels you is that good rejection, the handwritten rejection that said, this one's not for us, but, we see that you've got talent, try us again. Give us another shot. And also, the acceptances, you get an acceptance for a story, and then the story that's been rejected by, say, 25 different places then wins an award. And you're like, why is that so? It's just hitting the right person, the right reader, whether that's an editor or a judge or whatever, hitting them on the right day. And I did just keep working, and always have something to show. When people say, I didn't like that story, you say, well, I got another one. There's a few things will go into the drawer that will never see the light of day, but most of the stuff, you've got a stock of stuff, to just keep rolling out there. If they say, I don't like this one, give me something else.
Yeah. Is there still a market like that now for stories to go to literary journals and things like that?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. I think there always will be, and I think that the agents now are even more hungry, and they will dig through the literary journals, whether they're paper journals or whether they're online journals. They're always looking for good stories. They're always looking for good writers.
Wow, that's great. What was the first novel that you wrote that got noticed?
Well, I don't know if it got noticed. I wrote a novel called The Caretaker. It was sort of a riff on the sports writer and the moviegoer. So it was sort of a mock philosophical novel. And my stories had been noticed by some agents, and one big agent said, hey, you got a novel, I'd love to see it. And I had just finished it. It was kind of raw, and it was a mess. And I was like, yes, I got a novel. And so I sent it out to them. And the reader, it wasn't the agent, but the reader at the agent didn't get through it, didn't make it through the whole thing. I got the reader report, and of course I was just crushed. But and that was a drawer novel. So that was the first one. And I did a second one that sort of fell apart, and I cannibalized it, made stories of it. And some of those stories got out there. Then I did a third one. That was my thesis at Cornell. I went back for my MFA at Cornell when I was about 31. And I thought that was going to go. I got an agent for it, and we got to FSG, and there's an editor there that loved it, but she was junior and she couldn't get it through the editorial meeting, so they did rewrites, blah, blah, blah. And it just never happened. And then my fourth novel was Snow Angels, and I finished that. Manuscript won a prize, got a new agent, and they sold it in a week.
Wow. Overnight success.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, it probably took me, probably about 11 years to land that first novel at Doubleday. Yeah.
There's a lot that goes on in the background that people are not aware of a lot of times.
Well, I think they're more aware of it in the novel world, just because it takes so long to put a novel together. Yeah, and that apprenticeship for some of us is very long. And for others, the first novel is their best novel, and they never achieve it again. So it's a mysterious art.
Well, apprenticeship is a perfect word, and it's an idea that we're gradually losing sight of in just in our culture at large. The idea that you used to train for something and work with a master of the craft and learn from them, and then eventually strike out on your own. And it's a concept that's kind of foreign to us. People think that you just learn a trade, go into it, and the arts, writing especially, is one of those things that you really benefit from mentoring, trying the craft, getting feedback from other people, going through that editorial process. I hope we don't completely lose that.
Well, and the other pole of that is that we let experts handle everything. Right, and you don't have to have a master of fine arts to write a great book. You don't have to be fully trained to in every possible aspect of writing fiction to write a great book. I mean, some of our great writers are kind of raw, messy talents. I think of Theodore Dreiser or Philip K. Dick, Ray Bradbury, people like that. So it's a balance. You don't want to know too much. You don't want to get too smart, I think. Because then it will turn dry and brittle and thematic, and it'll read like literature, And Joyce said, "There's poetry, and the rest is literature." And all he wanted was the poetry.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, you mentioned earlier the time where there was some more plot coming into literary fiction and some of those devices that people were bringing over from genre fiction. What is that separation for you between genre fiction and literary fiction, and what makes a story one or the other?
Well, I think, it's a tough because there's a blur there. There's a great blur. Do we consider Raymond Chandler to be genre fiction? Or is it literary fiction, or is it both? You want that intersection. You want the two of them to come together so that you have the sort of best of both worlds. I mean, think of The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco. It's a mystery novel. There's a detective figure in it, but at the same time, it's a philosophical novel. It's got the beauty of the language. It kind of has everything to it. I think I'll go back to Faulkner. When I'm talking about literary fiction. And literary fiction to him was the human heart in conflict with itself. And just, the things that we desire are maybe not the things that are best for us there. The misgivings, the mixed feelings, the inexpressible, the ineffable. Can you do that at the same time run what we think of as a genre type plot? Sure we can, because those plots came out of things that people do, in life, and the things we don't quite understand why they do them. So that collision, that intersection, really, really interested me. Plus, I thought at the time, in sort of the early '80s, that a lot of what passed for literary fiction was just kind of boring. Not a lot happened. And so now you see with the new books like Henry himself. I'm writing it. Very little happens in this book. There's very little that you could sort of accuse of being cinematic or exciting or Spielbergian. So I come full circle on that, I think.
Well, speaking of Henry himself, and the story of these characters began with Emily, right?
Yeah, about 20 years ago.
Yeah. So what was it about this couple that fascinated you and held your fascination over this 20-year span?
Well, they're very ordinary. They're very sort of super average. I think. And yet everything that happens with them is, is big and important. I mean, what are the most important things in our lives? And I started thinking about that. And the most important things in our lives don't involve bank robberies and explosions and car chases and stuff like that. It's usually the simple stuff. It's usually the people closest to us. And I had just been interviewing a lot of people who had survived the Hartford Circus fire back in 1944. And so I was talking to people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they were just telling me their life stories and how things had changed, how they had changed, their children, their grandchildren, their neighborhoods. And I just started thinking, that's where a lot of the bigger stories are, very, very close to home. So I thought I wanted to write something that was very pointedly not story-driven or plot-driven. That became Wish You Were Here. And the framework is simply, Henry has died. Emily is driving to their lake cottage for the very last summer there because she has to sell it because she can't afford the taxes on it. So it's very, very kind of simple. The rest of the family doesn't want her to sell it, but they can't really do anything about it. They don't have the money to do it either. And so some of these hard feelings come out and in this week of vacation that they have. And I was going to write that book all about Emily, who was at the time in her 70s. But I started getting interested in all the other characters too. Her children, and the grandchildren, and the daughter-in-law who she doesn't get along with, and her sister-in-law who she doesn't get along with, and it just became large and sprawling and sort of Tolstoyan. Tolstoy if written by Chekhov. A drawing room drama that's 700 pages. And so I didn't quite finish with Emily. I didn't tell her whole story because I was concentrating on some of the other characters. So about 8 years later, I just had this fleeting thought of her. What's she doing? What is she doing right now? At this point, she's 80. Henry's been dead for 9 years, and so she's living by herself with her dog, over in this neighborhood here in Pittsburgh. And so I just thought, how does she get through her days? How does time move for her? What's going on with her? And I began to write that. And that became very fascinating to me, but I stuck with her. I said, we'll do, third subjective point of view. We'll stay with her and we'll go deep, and it'll become a life story because we'll get all of her memories as well. And I really liked that book because it is, what's the word for it? Truly intimate, getting very, very close with a character. And I liked that kind of book. I think of The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn by Breon Moore, the Irish writer. I love that book. And that was kind of maybe not a model, but at least a companion to it.
Yeah.
And
kind
then
of riffing off of that feeling.
A little bit. It's quiet, it's small, intimate, a little claustrophobic in a way. And, a few years back, I just started thinking about Henry and how in those two books, he kind of hovers over both books. He's never present because, he's dead in both, but everybody has their version of Henry in Wish You Were Here. They all see him from the outside or from this grieving perspective. Even the grandchildren see him that way. And then Emily, of course, and Emily alone is still talking to Henry. 9 years after he passed, she still talks to him every day. So I just started thinking, well, who is this guy? Who is he, from the inside? And I started thinking about giving him his own book. And then I thought of, Mrs. Bridge and Mr. Bridge and the combination of the two. So I wanted Henry himself to be a companion to Emily alone, so they could, be on the shelf together that way. And it's funny because when I finished, Henry himself, I realized that I had not only written a portrait of Henry, but really the story of their marriage. Henry himself is more of a story of their marriage than Emily is, which is kind of interesting, I think, because it's from the husband's perspective, which you don't usually get in that kind of story. And after I'd written Emily and I was touring with it, and, everybody had an Emily. Everyone in their family said, oh, this, Emily reminds me so much of my aunt, or so much of my grandmother, or so much of my, sister-in-law. And I want to think that everyone has their Henry too.
Yeah. Well, as I'm reading this story, I realize that these are my grandparents, and it resonated so deeply with me. My grandparents were, came through the Depression and World War II, and I absolutely loved my grandfather especially, and just held him on a certain pedestal. My mother, his daughter, had a completely different experience with him. And one thing I love about this book is that we kind of see everyone, who Henry was to everyone, and that this two-dimensional creature that we hold in our memories is so alive and so multifaceted. The same way that we want other people to think about us, is that we're not just the one thing that you think about us. And it really is an eye-opening experience to start to peel back the layers and realize that everyone has this dramatic story in the minutia of mundane life. It is where all this dynamic stuff happens. It's really a fascinating experience to look at just ordinary life and to realize how extraordinary ordinary life is.
And how much goes into life too.
Yeah.
But we're looking at Henry's, from the time he's about 6, until he's 75, and everything he goes through, and he goes through a lot. And a lot of that he keeps to himself. So it's that secret inner life of Henry that he will never share, even with Emily, who he's been with for almost 50 years. There's still part of Henry that's sort of inside and hidden.
Right. What did you start learning about Henry as you started telling his story? That you said earlier that he kind of hovered around the stories. When you focused on him and brought the focus close in on him, what are some things that surprised you about the character that maybe you didn't think of in the beginning?
Well, just his family life. His early life with his sister. His sister Arlene is older than he is, and so he calls her Queen Arlene because she rules the roost there. And just them playing together as kids, and the house that they grew up in, how it's changed, and how the city has changed, and how inextricably linked and woven into the fabric of Pittsburgh, the city, Henry is, and Henry's family, and his whole life. He's never lived anywhere else. His father helped to wire the skyscrapers downtown that were built in the 20s and 30s. So the city to him is very, very personal, in the way the neighborhood has changed. And he has moved probably 6 blocks in his life, from where he grew up to where he lives now. But it's a completely different world now. I guess the change in time, really, right? They say that's the subject of the novel, is time. It certainly seems true in Henry, the way the city changed, the way he changed, the way the neighborhood changed, the way his life changed, and what he thought he would be. And I think that came to me very early, that idea of him having to live up to the expectations of his parents and his grandparents and the family. He had an obligation, he had responsibilities, and from a very young age, he understood that.
Right. When you're telling a story like this, and it's not a genre novel that you can put your finger on that this is a mystery or what have you, what becomes the driver that pushes the story forward throughout time? I know we talked about how time and the way the world changes around him, but what becomes the catalyst, the driver that's pushing Henry through this story?
Well, for the selectivity that I'm trying to use across this, and also in Emily alone, is the things that stick with them, things that stay with them. What's indelible? What are they going to remember? What memories can't they forget? What do they revisit again and again in their lives? What they can't quite figure out? In the way that those memories encroach on their everyday life, and the way that they deal with other people, and also that idea of what is foremost on their minds at this particular moment, right? And in a lot of this book and in Emily, it's Margaret, their problem child. They don't know what to do with her, and it's a constant battle with her. And she is an alcoholic, and she has some other problems as well. And they're always trying to come to terms with her and how they've helped or not helped her in the past. It's sticky, the things that you want to do better, the things you want to get better, and yet they don't, and yet you keep trying. So there's this idea of endurance there, and what doesn't go away, what remains.
In the book walks a tightrope, but there's a fine line that when you're telling a story like this, you're walking. That the novel could be very sentimental and very kind of warm and fuzzy, and you wind up telling a version of Henry by doing that. And then the other side is it could be very cold and distant, and the trouble is that you wind up telling another very particular kind of story. How do you weave in and out of being so close to Henry, yet maintaining some objectivity so that we don't just paint him as perfect, or I'm struggling for the words that I'm looking for here, but we see Henry in his true self, not in a version that other people have created for him, or not just in one version, should we say. How do you keep Henry honest, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, you have to look at his flaws as well, because he is a very flawed person. He's a decent man. He's trying to do his best, but he has failures. And his failure, I think, with Margaret is one of the great ones, and he knows it. And Emily knows it too. That he did not support Margaret as well as he possibly could have. He was distant from the family at times and too caught up in his work. He has his odd little quirks. You want the book to not be cold and clinical. I think there's a problem in Mr. Bridge. I think Mr. Bridge becomes cold and clinical and almost cynical in its portrayal of its main character, whereas Mrs. Bridge doesn't have that problem. Mrs. Bridge is wry and warm, and yes, it shows her shortcomings, but in sort of a loving way. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't fall into the trap of Mr. Bridge, in painting Henry as somehow a villain or a cold-hearted person, because he's not. So in both cases, in Emily and Henry, it's just trying to stay true to the character. But since you're working in third person, you can separate yourself a little bit and show some of the blind spots that he has about the people that are closest to him and about the world, and his flaws. But don't paint them in a harsh or damning light, but try to make the reader understand that these are understandable and these are the flaws that we all have.
Yeah. Speaking of that perspective of the novel, and you definitely hit on it there about approaching this from a third-person perspective. If you would have written this in first person, are there some things that you would not have been able to do?
Oh yeah. And you can use the unreliable first person so that the reader could see through to what the character might be denying there. But I think it'd be a lot harder. Also, in terms of moving time, I think in first person is a lot harder to move time, to jump back. It becomes too stagey.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There has to be a device for it.
Yeah, the first one is just kind of clumsy, I think, at times, and hard to do. But if it's right for the storyline, it's right for the storyline. In this case, because I'd already written Emily in the sort of third intimate subjective, with a light bit of irony in there, and the very short sections, each of which has a beginning, middle, end, and has a little sort of moral to it or twist to it. I felt I'd try to do the same thing in Henry, because again, they have to be, companions. They have to be shelf mates there.
Right.
And I think it was, I think it is the right one for Henry too. That light touch.
Yeah, I agree. It's a lot to ask of a novel to have have an impact on readers and to have stated that impact from the beginning. But when people finish Henry himself and close that back cover, what do you hope they take away from the book?
Well, I hope they know Henry fully. By the end of the book, that they know this person. And I don't know if they have to love him or respect him, but they know him fully by the time that we close the book there. We don't need Emily alone. We don't have to have read Wish You Were Here or Emily Alone to understand him. But by the end of this book, you have a good hold on who this guy is. And maybe have some empathy for him, if not sympathy. I think that's about it. It's his world. It's his world that you're dropping into. It's a very particular world. And sometimes that world seems very small, but, you look closer, it's actually very big.
Yeah. Well, like I told you, I saw my grandparents in this book, and my grandfather especially, and by the end of the book, I was seeing myself as as a father myself, and as a son and a grandson, and I have some grown children now, and grandparentage will be down the road, hopefully not too soon. But you start realizing that we're all Henry in a weird way, and we all go through these cycles of life, and empathy becomes a lot easier when you can put yourself in his shoes. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think I helped the reader a little bit by that very beginning of the book, that first line, which is his mother named him Henry after her older brother, a chaplain killed in the Great War, as if he might take his place. And so there's the bar for like the 6 or 7-year-old Henry. He has to be as good, as noble, as caring, as giving, as devout as this perfect young man who went off to war and died trying to help other people. And he tries to live up to that. And it's not easy, but he does his best.
Well, as a Henry myself, I absolutely love this book, Stewart. It's a fantastic read, and it's not at all what I expected, and that's one of the things that I love about this book. If people are just discovering you and your work and want to know more about you and your back catalog and all that good stuff, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yeah, that'd be www.stewart-onan.com or .wordpress. But just, punch me in any old search engine, and that'll pop up.
Excellent. Stewart, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. We're going to send everybody to see you and to pick up their copy of Henry himself. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Hank.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Author Stories. Go to hankgarner.com to find all of the archives of the show, and be sure to subscribe while you're there. Now stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleb's The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Knoll was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke! It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Knoll. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dylan!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond, and in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God. He served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.